All right, thank you everyone for coming today. Really excited for the defense of Alyssa Meier. Alyssa's been here for 2 years now. She came to us from Colorado State University. It's been a little bit of time in between working on some various technician jobs, South Carolina, Wyoming, and Montana. Yeah, so she's done some really impressive work. This was a data set that she did not go out and collect herself. It was something that actually one of her committee members, Andy Little, it was part of his master's degree, this data that was collected, and she's just been able to take it to the next level. And that is extremely challenging when you just walk into a data set that you don't know anything about, and now you have to make sense of it. And she's done an excellent job of that, particularly given with COVID, and that she spent a year working on this from her house as opposed to being here surrounded by all the brightest minds of the wildlife field and biology field. Of course, we're all sitting in this room. So I am incredibly proud of Alyssa and the work that she's done, and I'm very excited for her to be able to talk to you about it today. So I will go ahead and turn the time over to her.
Thank you, Dustin. Right, so as he said, my name is Alyssa Meier. I'm here to talk to you today about the effects of hunter movement and habitat use on observation rate of white-tailed deer. And first, I'd like to do my acknowledgements. A big thank you to UNK for funding this project, Nova Research Institute, where the study took place, and all their help. My committee, Dustin Ranglack, Andy Little, Stephen Webb, Paul Berger, and Letitia Breckart. Also, thanks to Kenneth Gee and Steve Damaris for collecting the data that I use. And then, of course, I could have done any of this without my fellow grad students. As Dustin said, we went through COVID and grad school together. And I suppose I should also mention my main coworker, my dog Sanka. He was there with me the most. So without further ado, let's get into it. So my project mainly deals with predator-prey interactions. And for those of you that don't know about the red queen hypothesis, it comes from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And it kind of deals with the evolutionary arms race for survival. So basically with predator-prey interactions, that's how our prey adapting these anti-predator behaviors to survive, and in turn, how our predators adapting to continue to hunt them. So something that's come out of that field of research is the landscape of fear, which is an ecological concept that kind of describes how animals will use a landscape in response to predation pressure. And this first came about after reintroducing elk into Yellowstone, and how their behaviors are reintroducing wolves in Yellowstone, and how the elk changed their behaviors in response to that. And what they saw was elk changed their movement, so how fast and how far they would move in response to wolves. They changed their vigilance behaviors, so how often were they foraging versus how often were they watching for predators. And then also their habitat selection patterns, so how often were they selecting for open ground to forage in versus cover to remain hidden from predators. And so a lot of research has gone into this landscape of fear and anti-predator behavior and those interactions, and we've seen that hunting by humans, and I'm just going to refer to it as hunting from now on for clarity's sake, hunting by humans causes the same behavioral changes in prey. So what we see from the literature in response to hunting pressure, deer will increase their vigilance. That means they're foraging less, looking for predators more. They will decrease their movement. Flight can be attention tracking. So instead of fleeing from animals, or from predators, they might remain stationary and hidden better, which means they use greater amounts of cover to remain concealed from predators. They will increase nocturnal activity. So instead of foraging during the day, they'll often forage at night because hunting is illegal at night, so it makes sense. And also they will avoid roads. Hunters use a lot of roads. So in contrast, what behaviors do hunters do that affect their success? From this literature, we know that hunter success is affected by their effort. How much time are they willing to spend in a field to get a harvest? Prey density, so oftentimes, they're more likely to have a successful harvest if there are more animals around. Visibility, this one also kind of is a no-brainer, whereas they need to be able to see the deer in order to shoot them, so if they're able to see more of the deer, they can shoot them. Access roads, hunters will spend the majority of their time within 500 meters of a road. So the amount of roads in an area will greatly affect how much harvest success there is. And lastly, hunter experience, where the first 5 years of experience gained shows a huge increase in the likelihood of success, while after that it kind of plateaus. So as you can kind of see from this, a lot of the anti-predator behaviors of deer directly confound what hunters do that are more successful. Deer use more cover. Well, visibility is a huge deal for hunters, so if they're using more cover, they can't see the deer. Deer avoid roads. Well, access roads are a huge part of hunter success. So what about these behaviors are hunters either not changing or changing, and how does that affect this evolutionary arms race? And why that is important is because hunting is the main management tool for white-tailed deer in the U.S. Humans have replaced top predators in a lot of places around here, so management agencies rely on hunting and those harvest rates to control population sizes. And a lot of the previous research has really focused on this anti-predator behavior and how hunters affect deer behavior, but not so much has got into what actual hunter behaviors leads to these successes and leads to these behaviors. Hunting is a sport based long in tradition. A lot of these techniques and methods are passed down through the generations, and so it's kind of unchanging. So not a lot of research has gone to see what sort of behaviors are changing, again, in this evolutionary arms race, to see what is affecting hunter success. It used to, for previous research, they kind of relied on hunter surveys, where they kind of asked hunters to assess and evaluate their own actions and quantify it, which is open to bias, because it's asking a person to kind of understand what they did that day and then report that. But now, using fine-scale GPS technology, we can see what a hunter is doing across the landscape in time and space at a better scale to better ascertain what they're doing and what their behaviors are that lead to successes. So we'll get into the study area. My study, Andy's study really took place down in southern Oklahoma in Love County on the Oswald Road Ranch. For this study, they were trying to control, they were controlling hunting intensity across the landscape. So to do this, they split the study area into these compartments of high hunting pressure, low hunting pressure, then a control area. And then between the 2008 and 2009 hunting seasons, these compartments were rotated. So for this, the hunters were asked to do a few things. They were first assigned to a compartment for their hunting period. They were given a survey card where they filled out the start and end times of their hunts, how many deer they saw, and then they were asked to select a method of hunting down here, such as the ground blind and tree stand. They were also asked to carry a GPS unit with them that attempted a fix every minute. And they're asked to do this for the entirety of their hunt. So this is kind of what the data look like. And as you can see, it can be highly variable. These hunters were both out on the same day. One saw no deer, the other saw 18, and they were both selected tree stand hunting. So it's kind of like, what did they do different? Well, if we look at their movement data now, we can see that one hunter moved around a lot more, still was in their tree stand for a good chunk of time, but still covered a lot more ground, while the other one did not. So looking at that, it's kind of more difficult to ascertain what behaviors led to the variations in their success. And that leads to the question of what are these behaviors? And for the sake of this project, I'm using observation rate as a proxy to harvest success, because a lot of decisions go into making an observation of harvest, and those are kind of hard to quantify. So for this, we use observation rate. So how many deer did they see during their hunt? And so what behaviors affected this observation success, and in turn, what influences harvest success? So the goal of this is to increase, it's just to increase the scientific knowledge of hunter behaviors, and specifically, I am looking at their movement and habitat use behaviors. So my hypotheses, firstly, I predicted that as hunter movement increased, the observation rate would increase. Given that they kind of need to go to deer decrease their movement. So I hypothesize that as hunters increase movement, they'd be more likely to encounter a deer because the deer aren't moving. So a guy sitting in a tree stand is less likely to see a deer than someone still hunting and moving around. My second hypothesis was that as user cover decreased, so the amount of open ground in front of them increased, the more likely they were to observe a deer, and this is based on visibility being a huge factor of hunter success. So the more open the environment, the more likely they are to observe a deer. So let's get into my movement and habitat use analysis. The first thing I had to do, because this was a data set I inherited and it is about like over 10 years old at this point, was some data validation. So I went through and of the total 516 hunt records, these are individual hunts. I removed 29 for various errors. Some of them didn't have the GPS working. Some of them were just not hunting. They might have been moving a stand or a couple were blood trailing. And others just did not remain in the compartment. And since hunters were specifically instructed to only make observations in the compartment, I couldn't confidently say that the observations on their card were made in that compartment during their hunt, so I just removed them from analysis. The second thing I did for the GPS data points, I removed 30,000 GPS locations, and this is based on a truncation process, where I removed locations that weren't during legal shooting hours, so would be considered hunting. I also clipped it to their assigned compartments. Again, they're instructed to make observations within the compartment. And I also removed all transit from vehicles. So I looked at movement speeds and anything over like 80 meters per minute. I'm like, you're in a vehicle. So I removed all that, and that removed mostly all behaviors that can be considered hunting. And so after truncation, this is all of the GPS location points that I have. For both years. This is kind of what it looked like, and as you can see, it's kind of clipped there. I did my best. The process I used for analyzing the GPS data didn't like it when the points weren't continuous in time. So some of these, like there are a couple odd points in there, and that's just for the sake of analysis. And then for habitat use, I mainly use this raster file, land cover, on the property. It's kind of concealed, but this has information on forested habitat, mixed habitat, grasslands, landscape features such as barns, ponds, things like that, and then the surrounding roads. So firstly, I created my movement covariates, and I divided them into two behavioral suites, and this was movement speed and pass shape. And for all of those, I took all these summary statistics, and to explain what each of these are, step length is considered the distance between two consecutive points, and since my GPS fixes are regular, this can be considered meters per minute and a velocity. Net square displacement is the distance from the originate of the path. So we have the origin point there, it's each of the distances from there squared. And then residence time is how many points are within the standard GPS error. So it's a measure of stillness. So we did standard GPS error, which is about 13.6 meters. So anytime they were outside of that 13.6 meters of their previous point, it was outside of residence time. And we took this as a proportion of the hunt. So how often in their hunt were they remaining still? So a higher residence time, say 40% of their hunt, meant they were 40% of the time within 13.6 meters of their last point. So remaining still. And for pass shape, we have these two metrics, which is terrain angle and sinuosity. Terrain angle is just the degree of the turn from the last point as they move through the path, mountains and radians. And then sinuosity is an index of pass shape from 0 to 1, where 0 is a straight path and 1 is a curvy path. So how much did they deviate throughout it? So those are my movement covariates, and again, I took summary statistics and separated these into behaviors. For habitat use, we did it as how much of the compartment was available to them versus how much they used. So for forest use, if we're looking here, this is forested habitat with our GPS points here. This is riparian. So how much of their hunt did they spend in riparian habitat versus mixed? So as a proportion of use. And then the others, we use distance to landscape features. So it's like distance from a barn, distance to a pond, that sort of thing. And then the last metric we used was slope roughness, which is the standard deviation of the slope. The ranch is in Oklahoma, so the elevation change on the entire property is only about 100 meters. So this is a better metric for differences in terrain that they choose. So to analyze the, oh gosh, am I keeping up on these? So to allow for more direct comparison between all these covariates, I standardized the data using these methods, and then I transformed all of them into these appropriate functional forms because we couldn't assume that all these relationships were nonlinear. And so we have linear, pseudo-threshold, and quadratics. And then to minimize the amount of competing covariates in each model, we used a multi-level modeling process. And this analysis had three levels of models, where the first one selected for the best summary statistic for that metric and the best functional form. And we took each within 2 delta AIC of each other and moved them into that next model, where I was looking at the best representation for that behavioral suite. And then all those covariates moved into that top model at the very end. So let's get into the results. Quick summary. So again, I used 487 hunt records for my analysis. 83 individual hunters participated. 1,333 observations were made, which is about 2.74 deer per hour between the 2 years, and a total of 29 harvests occurred between those 2 years. So one of the things I did to make sure the assumption that observation rate was an appropriate proxy to harvest success was I ran a logistic regression on observation versus the harvest rate to get the probability of harvest. And indeed, as the number of deer and observation rate increases, the probability of harvest also increases. Though, because there were only 29 harvests versus 1,300 observations, as we get further up, it's a highly variable relationship. Next, we'll get into the model selections. These are my 2 behavioral suites. These were the top models within 2 delta AIC. And because they are both in 2 delta AIC, we went with the most parsimonious. So for that, for movement, it was mean turning angle as a quadratic and linear mean step length in the top model. And for habitat use, it was proportion of forest use. So looking at that now, okay. This is the main takeaway here. There we go. Basically, moderate nonlinear movement through forested habitat increases probability of observation success. So what that means is zigzag through a forest at a moderate pace and you're going to see a deer. But to really break it down, if we actually look at these units, the highest represented degree, okay, good, it didn't work. All right, the highest represented degrees here is about 40 degrees of turning, which is less than a quarter turn. So if you're walking, you're turning about this. This is 40 degrees movement. It's not a big turn at all. Same with mean step length. The average walking pace of a human is about 3 to 4 miles per hour. The fastest, about 40 meters per minute here, translates to about 1.5 miles per hour. So even though these are increasing, or showing an increase as you get more drastic, it's really still a slow, methodical movement through a forest. So the people that are still hunting, moving through a forest, they're not moving very quickly, but they are at least moving more. So it's important to note that they're not like running through a forest and busting all the deer. They are still hunting. All right. Oh no, it's not working.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's not good. So now if we look at what Dr. Little found in his study for deer movement and habitat use, we see that deer increase their use of forest, increase their use of mixed habitat, and decrease their movement as the hunting season went on. He also found that unobserved deer moved 38% less than deer that moved, or deer that were observed. So hunters that are moving regularly through a forest are more likely to see a deer because they're not only overlapping this increased use of forest, but they are potentially, and we can't be sure, triggering a flight response by encountering these deer, which are more observable because they are moving than the deer that remain still. So this could be why hunters that are moving through a forest are seeing more deer. And now we're going to switch gears a bit. We're going to look at hunter resource selection. And so instead of observation rate, we'll now be looking at probability of use or selection by a hunter. So a resource selection function is a way to look at how habitat selection across the landscape. So what are individuals using versus what is available? So the way I represented this was I considered the compartment the hunters were assigned to what was available to them. And because we're using a raster cell, I converted all of the cells within the compartment into a point and called those used or unused. That's what was available to them. So theoretically, a hunter could have used any of these cells, and now we're seeing which ones they actually used in the blue here. And that's what their presence. And so to make these covariates, we also had to consider what scale the hunters perceive a landscape at. How are they making these decisions? What are they looking at to make these decisions? And so we considered that the scale of landscape to be the shooting window, which they can see, which Oklahoma is about 150 meters. So within that 150 meter shooting window, what are they selecting to hunt in? And so if we kind of look at this a little more detailed, if we have our hunter here and in his 150 meter window in all directions, what percentage of that window is forest? What percent is mixed? What is riparian? How far are they from a pond? That sort of thing. And so similar to the habitat use, I looked at habitat type and landscape features and their sweeps. And similarly, I used distance to ponds, the distance covariates, and then also slope roughness. But this time we are using as the percent of the shooting window versus proportion of the hunt. That's it. And then again, same thing, I standardized all the data and transformed them into the appropriate functional forms. And oh, okay. So it wasn't bad.
Your dog was howling.
Oh, okay, that sounds right. All right, well, anyway, so same as before, I used the multi-level modeling process. This time I only used 2 levels of modeling. The first one looked at the appropriate functional form and behavioral suite and moved that into the top model based on which ones were within 2 delta AIC. And so let's get into the results of that. All of them were considered significant, so they all moved into the top model, and these are those results. If we're looking here, about moderate use of forested habitat had the highest selection, while mixed habitat was selected for more regularly when available. And then the lowest riparian habitat selected for was about 50% of the shooting window. And so the important takeaway here is that hunters are more regularly selecting for mixed habitat rather than forested habitat, even though before we saw forests had a larger effect on observation rate. And that could be, and again, deer also selected for more forested and more mixed. And so that could be because of visibility. So as we go from the habitat types from grassland to forest, visibility decreased. And so hunters might have been selecting for mixed habitat because they would have increased visibility in those areas. However, because deer are selecting for more cover, the hunters that are selecting for more forested habitat are seeing more deer because they're overlapping with the largest prey density in the area. And it was also found that deer change their behavior within the first 3 days of the hunting season, so that reaction is pretty quick. So it could be that because deer respond so quickly to hunting, overlapping where they are is more important than visibility at that point because they use cover very quickly within those first 3 days. And if we get into landscape features, we see that hunters select for higher, more rougher slopes, I should say. The distance to anthropogenic features, they selected for closer ones. If they're close to a pond, they're more likely to use it than if they're farther away. And then the distance to road plateaus very quickly. A lot of these relationships we're seeing right here, I think, are simply because of the way the range is set up. So none of the distance covariates were significant in my observation rate analysis because of the way this range is set up. The only roads available on the property were these outside roads. So because of my truncation, I removed a lot of use of road, or all the use of roads actually. So it makes sense that as distance to roads increases, the probability of use increases because we're going to have more hunters in these areas and they're further away from roads. Similarly, the relationship with ponds, not all of these compartments have ponds available to them, so they don't have the option to use them. And the same thing with anthropogenic features, there are very few of them on the property itself, so the relationship is pretty limited as far as what hunters are actually selecting for versus what they were given in their compartment. So that's why we didn't see a huge impact on observation success. One thing in the literature that we saw was that topography could have a big effect on hunter success. And again, one of the reasons I probably didn't see this in my results is because there wasn't a lot of topography to be had on the property. So it's a lot of limitations as far as what the property had to offer that other literature is saying. So, conclusions. We'll revisit this slide, just to remind you that what deer do in response to hunting pressure is increase their vigilance. They are more likely to flee as the hunting season goes on. They're more vigilant and watching for danger. They decrease their movement rates to remain inconspicuous. They increase their use of cover for the same reasons. Increase nocturnal activity to avoid hunters because they can't hunt at night, and they avoid roads. The literature is saying that observation rate, and we're calling it now, is influenced by the hunter effort, prey density, visibility, access roads, and experience. I specifically didn't really look at experience. We didn't have a lot of access roads. So my main work between visibility and prey density, well, we found that prey density had the largest effect on observation rate, just because as hunters are overlapping their habitat use with the deer, they are more likely to encounter them. So the higher the prey density is in these forest areas, the more likely they are to encounter them. So for future research, something that was kind of limiting in my data was just knowing the time of the observation success. All I had was a general summary of what all these hunters did during their hunts. So we don't know exactly when the deer were observed, what the hunter was doing at the moment of observation. We just know what they did over their entire hunt and how many deer they saw their entire hunt. So something that would be interesting in the future would be to look at more time-specific data as far as when they're making these observation successes. So we know in that moment, are they actually moving through a forest or were they out in the open? So that would eliminate that relationship a lot more. Another thing would be not limiting the hunters to a compartment. That was, of course, a part of the hunting pressure, hunting intensity study, so that was part of it. But when hunters are allowed a full breadth of decision-making on a landscape scale, what are they choosing to do? That'd be important to look at, like with the same spatial scale, temporal scale, just without limiting to a compartment. And then also looking at different study areas and different prey species as they exhibit different behaviors and also just different habitat types might change that relationship to cover as well. For instance, a research out in the plains of Montana found that the topography and visibility are a huge indicator, but that's because it's the plains of Montana. So it's just something to look into to develop this more for hunter behavior and how that changes from place to place. And lastly, it would be important to have a study with higher rates of harvest to have a stronger, to see if there is that strong relationship between observation rate and harvest success. 29 harvests over a few years doesn't really say much, so that would be another important thing to look at to make sure that that relationship exists. And so the reason this research is important is because hunting is the main management tool for white-tailed deer across America. And something that, getting ahead of myself. The other thing is white-tailed deer populations are also increasing pretty dramatically. And so we're seeing a lot of more urban deer and suburban deer populations, and that management is becoming more and more important as they kind of cross over with humans more. But the problem is our hunter recruitment and retention rates are decreasing. So we're losing hunters even though hunting is now becoming more important. And so one of the reasons this research is important is because a lot of the boundaries to starting hunting is knowledge. because it is a sport based in tradition and a lot of the methods are passed down, people that don't have that basic knowledge don't know where to start and might not be successful. So being able to tell them, hey, go move through a forest at a moderate pace, you're gonna see a deer, is a place to start. Zigzag through a forest. So, I mean, they'll at least see the deer, that's all I can guarantee. I want to put an asterisk by it. But yeah, so there's a huge initiative going through this R3, recruit, retain, and reactivate for hunters, because we do need them as a management tool as all the populations are increasing. Just being able to identify specific methods, specific areas for new hunters, for targeted hunts for urban deer, where there's a limited area, like if we can say like put hunters here, here, and here, and they'll see the most deer, that makes that management more effective. And then just, we just need to increase the knowledge on hunter behavior and not make as many assumptions as we have about it. So that's why this research is important, why it should be continued, and we shouldn't discount humans as a predator on the landscape. So with that, thank you for listening.
All right, thanks, Alyssa. We do have time for questions, and if you have questions on Zoom, if you will put them into the chat and I will read them out. Want to make sure that everyone is involved here. So.
I've got a couple questions that I assume it was during the rifle season.
Yes, yeah, it was the fall rifle season.
And so what time of, I'll ask a couple questions. So what time of year was that, and was it during the peak breeding season? But also with that, do you know what selectivity the hunters were doing? Were they selecting for just bucks or any deer? Because the one saw 18, was he passing on 15 of those in range?
Right. So firstly, the first question, this was late, or I don't know if it's late in Oklahoma, but it was between mid-November and early December, about those 3 weeks, I think, 3 or 4 weeks. For 2008-2009 rifle season. And as far as what they're selecting for, that's one of the reasons we were doing observation rate instead of harvest success, because they were noting bucks, does, fawns, all those on the cards, and it just kind of knows us how many deer they're seeing. I don't know if you wanted to add anything for what.
Yeah, and there was basically a quota. That's why that was one of the things in the harvest success. It wasn't because people just weren't necessarily seeing deer. They couldn't. There were certain numbers that the quota allows put out for the property. There's only so many bucks, so many does that can be harvested on the property.
So a 16-day rifle season, like you said, the rut does occur right before, so it starts the weekend before Thanksgiving and runs through the first weekend in December. And so the peak rate is falling right before that. There's still a lot of breeding going on during this period in there to answer that question. And then they were allowed to shoot 20 does each year. 1 year it was up to 4 bucks, and the other year it was up to 5 bucks.
Each individual?
No, that's for the entire range. For the entire range. That way there was actual hunting out there, but the collared bucks were off limits.
Yeah,
That was the
because we obviously only had so many collared bucks, we didn't want to harvest all of them because we had no data for the project. So.
And I believe we also found on the study that they switched rutting behavior to like nocturnal, nocturnally more. No,
I wouldn't say it that way.
Okay.
In terms of the weather activity. That was all, the graph you showed was all based on movements.
Gotcha.
About how there was a slight shift in movement behavior at night versus during the day compared to, kind of preseason and other studies that were in the region.
Right, I think that Philadelphia, I think.
I'm curious, and I might have missed this. Did you have unique hunter information?
I did.
So they had a GPS on them, the same GPS each time. So you knew, like, if Brian went out 17 times of your 83 hunters, you would know that he's or was he just one of the 83? Or did all 17 trips count as part of the 83?
All records were linked to both the record number and a hunter ID. So we knew if a hunter went out multiple times, we knew which hunts were associated with that hunter, yeah.
Okay, so did you have like each hunter had its own data set that you made an average of their movement over their 7 trips?
No, we, we looked into individual I did run a mixed effects model with individual hunter ID, and it didn't have, it wasn't as strong an effect as without it, so I didn't include it. But no, for my main analysis, it was just by hunt record and not by individual hunt.
Okay, so my question then, I guess I had to lead up to this, sorry about that, Alyssa, but, so let's say somebody like me who's pretty naive at hunting, and I'm very not successful. And maybe somebody like Will, who's gonna go out the first time and get it, like you get one record from him and you get 10 trips from me. So are you worried that your data set might be overloaded with the people that had to go out multiple times? Because they didn't shoot, because once you harvest it, would they just randomly go out and hunt again without having an opportunity to harvest?
So they were required, the research was the primary objective. And so they were required to spend a certain amount of time within the compartments during the period. And so we forced them to go out there. And so even if they shot it.
If they tagged out the first half hour, you made them come back the next 5 days, do you think their behavior altered or they did the same behavior they would have had they not been successful the first day?
And I guess it would depend on what we're calling successful, because they still had the opportunity to shoot deer.
Oh, so they were unlimited number that they could shoot. It was based off the quota, not. Like, so Will could have shot all 100 from the property if he was able to get out.
On the does.
On the does,
On the buck, it would be one buck per participant. But they could go out and shoot multiple does if they wanted to.
Yeah, and we definitely, and we did have hunters that harvested and still had several other hunt records with them too.
Okay.
So yeah, it wasn't one and done.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Thank you.
I guess, as a wildlife biologist, just how would you bridge that gap of knowledge with new hunters?
I think a good way, like maybe an efficient way, just at hunter safety courses, perhaps they could also offer like, oh, you want to go deer hunting, let's like have a course about that where it covers information like this. I know a lot of websites have like where to set up your tree stand, stuff like that. But I think in hunter safety would be a great way to, at least for the beginners, to kind of get them a place to start more than just checking off, like, you know what to do when you kill it, but it's like, okay, but how do I get to that step? Maybe cover that better in those classes. I think that'd be a good choice.
Are there like similar studies that have been done regarding the research that you did, or is this kind of groundbreaking? I guess the reason I ask is if it's been done on different areas throughout like the United States, and if they've found similar results to what you did.
Not that I'm aware of as far as analyzing GPS data like this. The closest I can think of, a lot of the focus is on the prey species, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately, just everyone's more curious about that than human hunters. But the closest one I can think of was ptarmigan hunters in Norway. It was kind of the first one where they used GPS units, and they're like, oh yeah, and they found the hunters were like all around the cabin, and they're like, they got about like 500 meters from their cabin, shot one, and then went back. But as far as deer hunters, a lot of it is still surveying them afterward and all that stuff. And I think there are a couple studies out and about right now, but from the published literature, I'm not aware of one right now.
Just curious, so this is fantastic stuff, by the way. I really like what I'm seeing here. So this is, and I think it's getting at good questions, but obviously if these were the originally intended questions, Dr. Little probably would have answered them as part of his PhD, right? So from your end of it, these opportunistic behaviors where we have data sets are critical for us. We have stuff out there. What else can we glean from them? But if you were to go back and you were to do it just for your questions, what would you have done differently just so you could have it specifically to answer this a little better than maybe it was? Would you set it up any differently? Would there been anything?
It would be mostly the compartments themselves. Yeah, a lot of like the limiting to the compartments was a difficult part. Yeah, I think that'd be the main thing, would just be like, here's the property, like it still have that boundary there, because obviously you can't wander everywhere. But as far as understanding with when they have like that full like landscape to select from, what would they actually choose versus that 300 hectare compartment? I think that would have helped out a lot. The other one, and I'm not sure about, that'd be the hard one with trusting hunters. It's like human bias, but like if I don't know about GPS units and 2008 either, but being able to like drop a waypoint when they sight a deer instead of just like, oh, I saw a deer, but that's also asking a lot when they're like trying to move, have a gun and everything else. So those would be the two things I would want, would be not limiting them to a space and also just clicking like, okay, I saw a deer here, so I know in my GPS points like, oh, okay, this is what they're doing in that moment. So that would help me a lot as far as answering movement and habitat use. Amanda.
Do you think instead of like what you just mentioned, having them, that would be a lot, having to like put a waypoint, do you think if they would have just put the time, that you would have been able to look at your data and like, oh, at 11:57, here is their point? Would that have been possible? Then you could have just account that like, okay, here's where they actually saw the deer.
Yeah, just if I had any sort of time information, yeah, I wouldn't know how to set that up. That'd be something maybe with more recent technology. If they had their GPS units and just like click that button and that meant observation, that'd be
Yeah, that
nice.
would be really cool.
Instead of like stopping to write anything down. Because honestly, a lot of my data validation was, the start and end times were all incorrect. So like most of that survey stuff didn't help me much. Yes.
I'm curious to know if the data you had gave any information on the demographics of the hunters. Were they mostly young, was there a particular age group, male to female, were there differences along those lines if you had that information?
The only thing I could assume would be male, female, but even that, like, can't really assume. No, I didn't really have any demographic information. We did consider trying to track down everyone and getting that in there. That'd be another thing to add in there. Experience would be really cool to look at. It just wasn't a part of the data set. And 10 years out from the study, it might have been difficult to track down at that point. But yeah, I did not have that information. I mostly looked at the hunters as their number. Anything in the Zoom?
I haven't seen anyone. Let me just maybe open the chat and see. I don't see anything here, so.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you all so much. Let's give her a round of applause.